Welcome back to the channel, guys. Today we're going to be taking a look at a couple of different bayonets and knives from World War I, and we're going to start with the M1905. The model of 1905 bayonet was originally manufactured to fit the 1903 Springfield rifle. The M1905s were in production from 1906 to 1922, and they were made by the Springfield Armory and the Rock Island Arsenal. Between those two manufacturers, they made about 1,200,000 between those years. The M1905 has a 16-inch blade with a wooden handle. Now, even though they stopped making these in 1922, they did pretty much remanufacture them in 1942 to 1943, but with the plastic handles on them. And this will, the exact same bayonet, just different handles, but this will also fit the M1 Grand, and that's what those were remanufactured to fit as well during World War II. Now this example is a Springfield Armory model, and here you can see US with a serial number on it on this side of the blade, and on this side you see an SA for Springfield Armory with the flaming ordnance bomb and the date of 1914. You can see the little catch here, which you need to press that. That's what locks that in to the rifle, and that's also what releases this from the sheath. Next, we're going to take a look at the M1905 bayonet, but this one has been cut down and modified to be a fighting knife instead of a bayonet. Now this example of the M1905 bayonet was originally a 16-inch bayonet that has been cut down to a shorter blade to be some sort of trench knife or fighting knife. You can tell that these weren't produced this way specifically, like some of the ones during World War II were, because that blood groove goes all the way almost to the tip. So you can tell that was definitely cut off and then reshaped. In addition to that, they cut off that barrel ring that was on the other bayonet. And they also took out that little mechanism right there that would lock this into the rifle. So there's no way that this can be used as a bayonet. This is just a fighting knife now. And another cool little thing is, as you see here, the original owner must have been in the 16th Cavalry, and his initials FHC. Now I tried to look up that, but I couldn't really find too much info on someone that matched that description, but I'm not the best at doing personnel research, but I'll keep looking into it. But yeah, other than that, just a pretty cool example. One of the first ones that I had personally seen of a cut-down World War I version. Like I said, plenty exist for the World War II versions, and looking into it, they do exist a lot for the World War I. It was just the first one I had seen, so I thought it was pretty cool. Next up, we're going to take a look at two examples of the M1917 bayonet that goes with the M1917 Enfield rifle. So here I have two examples of the US M1917 bayonets. And to understand the M1917 bayonet, there's a little bit of a confusing history behind it that I'll briefly touch upon. So the M1917 bayonet is the exact same bayonet as the British pattern 1913 bayonet. That bayonet itself is based off of the British pattern 1907 bayonet, which is made to fit the SMLE, or the short magazine Lee Enfield rifle. That was the British main battle rifle throughout World War I. So basically, they came up with an experimental rifle that they called the pattern 1913 Enfield that they wanted to replace the SMLE with. But during the outbreak of the war, they are already short on SMLEs, and they didn't want to remachine all of their shops to start making that rifle. So they just kept producing SMLEs, and they actually contracted out making the other rifle to the U.S. And so Remington and Winchester actually won contracts to make those rifles, which they basically just renamed them pattern 1914 Enfields. And obviously, to go along with those rifles, those two companies made a bunch of the bayonets as well. And actually, Remington ended up making 1,243,000 of the pattern M1913 bayonets, and Winchester made about 225,000 of the pattern 1913 bayonets to go with those pattern 1914 Enfields. Now, that all being said, the M1917 bayonet comes into play because upon our entry into World War I, we found ourselves short on M1903 rifles. So we essentially just took that pattern 1914 Enfield, rechambered it into a 30-06 caliber instead of the British 303, and we just renamed it the M1917 Enfield. And to go along with that, we had about 545,000 of the pattern 1913 bayonets that we made for the British military but never sent them. So we just re-stamped them, and then we produced about 2 million in addition to that. So the reason I have two is this one here is one of those British proof ones to where you can actually see the little British crown stamp right there. And all we did is we took that, stamped over it. There we go. Stamped over it and then stamped a US marking there and there on it. And then on this side, you can see that original 1913 stamp, and we just stamped 917 under it with a little Remington circle on that. So that, as collectors, that's what we refer to as a British proof 1917 bayonet. Now this one is just a standard 1917 bayonet. So if you look here, it's got the little U.S. flaming ordnance bomb, a little eagle head stamp, and the U.S. emblem on there. And then on this side, 1918, with the little Remington logo on that as well. Now the reason that both of these have grooves in the wooden handles was to differentiate the pattern 1913 and the M1917 bayonets from those pattern 1907 bayonets that fit the SMLEs, because they look identical except for just having a little bit different size guard, but look-wise they're identical. So that was just a quick way to say, hey, this is going to fit this rifle and not that rifle. Now, it said we had produced about 2 million during wartime, and that seems like a lot, but that also, not only did that fit the M1917 rifles, but it fit all 7 of the major trench shotguns that we used during World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and even up into the modern, like, early 2000s. Up next is the model of 1917 Bolo Knife. Here we have the M1917, or model of 1917 Bolo Knife. The M1917 is pretty much a direct copy of the 1910 Bolo Knife that Springfield Armory produced. The major difference being the M1910 was definitely a higher quality knife. Springfield Armory made about 60,000 of those, but due to wartime requirements, they had to come up with something that was a little bit cheaper and easier to manufacture. So out comes the 1917 Bolo Knife. The big difference is that there's a little latch for the sheath that would go on here, like that other bayonet, the M1905 that I showed earlier. So they removed that, and it's just a lower quality steel than the 1910s. So these were produced in very large numbers through 1917 and 1918 by the Plum Company and ACCO. And these weren't definitely not issued to every soldier, but like machine gun units would get them to clear brush for fields of fire and whatnot. But and then one other big difference is that the pommel ended up being made into one piece, to where some of the earlier models, it was a piece that was put in and pinned, or there's a couple different variations, but this one is just one solid piece. Now, if you look here, it's got 1917 and CT basically means this is the low quality version. It's commercial quality. That's why they stamped those, to differentiate between the more expensive and nicer, higher quality Springfield ones. And then here you've got ACCO Chicago 1918. And if you noticed, the grips have obviously been replaced. They're not the original. That's a completely different screw than what would be in there. And they look a little bit newer. But I did look up this Pat Marzial, and the serial number, and I did come up with someone who did serve in the Philippines during World War II. So kind of interesting to wonder if this knife served, in World War I and World War II, or, how did that gentleman get it? Was it a hand-me-down? Was it a take-home? Was he issued it just during World War II? Things that we obviously don't know, but kind of fun to theorize as collectors. And there is another name here that I could come up with, only like a Bob H and then like a RDWA. Not super sure. I couldn't really find anything on that, unfortunately. Just the initial, that larger Pat Marzial name. Like I said, there's his little serial number there. But it's a nice example of just one of the ACCO CT 1917 Bolo knives. And last but certainly not least is the 1918 Mark I trench knife. I'm actually not going to do anything on this one. I've already put up a full-length video prior, so if you want some details, go check that out. And until next time, guys, be good.